Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Family Caregiver Alliance for Genuine Resilience is Closer and Easier Than You May Think. I'm Calvin Hu, Education Coordinator at FCA and your host. For 4 decades, FCA has been working across the Bay Area and the nation to improve the well-being of family caregivers. We offer support through consultations, classes, workshops, publications, retreats, research, and advocacy. If you'd like to learn more about us or access our online resource center, FCA Care Journey, please visit caregiver.org. Today, I'd like to welcome our guest, Roy Reamer. Roy is the Executive Director at Zen Caregiving Project, which was formerly Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco. He has been an end-of-life caregiver and educator since 1997. He is guiding instructor of mindful caregiving education and is a facilitator of open death conversations, speaking and teaching internationally on the topics of mindful caregiving and end of life. Roy also guides wilderness-based rites of passage programs in partnership with Earthways LLC of Sebastopol, California, and he is a student of Soto Zen. So now that you know a little bit more about our guest, I'd like to turn things over to Roy.
Thank you, Calvin, and I want to thank the FCA for hosting the webinar today. And thank you to everyone who's logged in and is participating. So I'll give you a little bit more about my background as we get started. I started with Zen Hospice Project as a volunteer caregiver in '97. And at the time, I was a student of meditation and mindfulness. And the experience was an opportunity to take what I knew about meditation and apply it to caregiving. It was a great opportunity to learn how to build my own resilience. And this came in really handy. It was really useful. When my mother was at the end of her life, my mother died about 2.5 years ago. And while I was a long distance caregiver, I witnessed my father in the role of primary family caregiver. And I felt like what I had learned through being at the bedside of the dying and through my own meditation and mindfulness practice, I was able to support him to be in that role. So I feel like through that experience and working with family caregivers in our courses, I've learned a lot about both the rewards and the challenges of being a family caregiver. So I have deep respect for all of you and the work that you're doing in your life. So at Zen Caregiving Project, we offer both online and in-person courses, and our courses are designed to support caregivers in developing emotional resilience. So we can say more about this at the end, but please visit our website to learn more about our courses. And we're at zencaregiving.org. So this is what we're going to be looking at today together. We're going to answer this question, why focus on resilience? And we'll look at the relationship between resilience and mindfulness, and how mindfulness is developed and its benefits. I will guide us all through a short meditation so we get to actually work with the practice a little bit. And then I'll share with you practical interventions to build mindfulness. And then I will introduce a self-compassion practice for supporting resilience. And then we'll recap and we'll open it up for questions and answers. Next slide, please. So this is one definition of resilience, so that we're all talking about the same thing here. A feature of our response to adversity. And adversity comes in many shapes and forms, but it's also the ability to recover from the ups and downs that life presents, and the ability to have increased hope, reduced stress, and greater spirituality, whatever that spirituality is, and plus more of a positive attitude in the face of the challenges of life. Now, here's a favorite definition of mine. It's a little bit simpler than the previous one. So resilience is really the ability to bounce back from difficulty or the challenges that we encounter in our life. And this is including adversity, vulnerability, loss, and grief. So things that come up often for a lot of family caregivers. All right, so why do we focus on resilience? This slide is a simple presentation of the relationship between mindfulness, resilience, and well-being. Next slide. So in 2015, there was an interesting study that was published in a journal known as the Personality and Individual Differences Journal. And it showed that resilience is actually built from mindfulness. And when we begin to develop resilience, we see that it enhances a sense of well-being and it lowers stress levels. Next slide, please. So we begin to see that resilience is the mediator in the relationship between mindfulness and well-being. So again, mindfulness leads or builds resilience, and then resilience is what gives us a greater sense of well-being and reduces stress. So if mindfulness leads to resilience, how do we cultivate mindfulness? How can we do this when we are living the busy life of a family caregiver and holding down a lot? So first, let's just define mindfulness. And I would define this, as you can see on the screen, if you have a screen in front of you, a flexible state of mind where we pay attention on purpose to one's present moment experience without judgment. So the on purpose really speaks to the quality of mind where we notice when we become distracted. And when we notice we're distracted, we return to the focus of our attention. And it's very natural for the mind to become distracted. It's really impossible, I would say, to eliminate distraction. The without judgment part of that first definition is really about returning to the focus of our attention without being too hard on ourselves that we've become distracted yet again. So we simply return to the focus of our attention, like our breath, and we refocus, and when we become distracted, we refocus again. So this is also a practice where we're developing the ability to observe our own minds and our own experience, I would say, dispassionately. So we're not getting caught up with the emotions that can arise under certain circumstances. So it's really about cultivating awareness. And as we develop our ability to become more aware of our internal processes, we're less likely to get swept up in physical, emotional, or mental reactions to stressful situations, or we're less likely to lose control or feel like we have lost control. So I want to mention a 2011 study that showed mindfulness training programs have consistently been found to reduce self-reported measures of perceived stress, anger, rumination, or even physiological symptoms, while also improving positive outlook, empathy, self-compassion, and overall qualities of life. And that's a study that appeared in a journal known as the Clinical Psychology Review. So mindfulness is typically developed through the practice of meditation. Next slide. So a disciplined inner reflective practice that calms the mind and heightens awareness. So this is one definition of meditation. It's, we find that a tranquil and calm mind leads to greater awareness of one's physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, and attitudes. And then this leads to a deeper understanding of their dynamics. And then this deeper understanding leads to a recognition of the role of our thoughts, our beliefs, our habits, our moods that really underlie much of our suffering that we experience. Suffering such as stress, anxiety, chronic frustration, and even a constant lack of satisfaction. So I would also say that meditation provides a pause or a break from our busy, hectic lives, our modern technological lives that are filled with so many things vying for our attention. We learn through meditation how to take stock of the bigger picture of life and ideally or possibly not get caught up in the little stuff. Next slide, please. One thing to remember is that, next slide, it is not necessary to go out and buy a meditation cushion and dedicate a special place in your home to meditation and carve out a big chunk of time from your busy day to meditate. Now, if you were to do this, that would be wonderful. It is true that the more one meditates, the greater the impact on mindfulness. However, resilience, the greater the impact on mindfulness, resilience, and well-being. So short, simple meditative activities throughout your day can build mindfulness. So I want to provide you with some ideas for these short mindfulness interventions. But first, let me say more about the benefits of mindfulness and how they influence resilience. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide, you can see 3 areas of benefit from cultivating mindfulness. We see it calms the mind, it improves concentration, and it builds awareness. So first, looking at the calm mind, when we have a calm mind, we can respond skillfully rather than react in ways that can make matters worse. For instance, our loved one may say something that offends us, and with a calm mind, we may pause and make it clear to them what has offended us, but do it in a way that doesn't add fuel to the fire. When we display a calm presence, I would say it also has a calming influence on those around us. So take a moment to think about what it feels like for you when you're with someone who is agitated, as opposed to when you're with someone who is calm and grounded. I think most of us would agree it feels really different. And so each of us has these wonderful mirror neurons in our brains that responds to others' energy. So if we're calm and grounded, the one we're with, our loved one, the recipient of our care, they will actually begin to calm down as well. When it comes to concentration, a scattered mind can be really exhausting. A focused mind conserves energy. In meditation, we call the busy mind monkey mind. But focused attention really can become the antidote to mental exhaustion. And secondly, we all make mistakes. We're human. And when caring for a loved one, we know that a small mistake can have big consequences. So just think of administering medication to your loved one or taking notes during an appointment with a doctor. So a small mistake can have big consequences. So strengthening our ability to focus cuts down on mistakes. And thirdly, when we talk about awareness, when we build awareness, we begin to notice the habits of our mind. We catch ourselves in negative thought patterns sooner, and we can return to presence or focused attention. So for example, rehashing past problems. This is really common, we all do it. Or anticipating or dreading the future, thinking about the future, or just experiencing frustration. If we're not paying attention, if we're not aware of our thought patterns, then we can really spin out into the stories we tell ourselves. So through mindfulness, we can spend less time spinning out in unhealthy or harmful thoughts. And this awareness, this interrupting of these thought patterns, it really helps us bounce back from difficult situations. And we learn to let go of stuff more quickly. I would say we just very naturally let go of stuff more quickly. So when we are aware of the subtle physical sensations in the body, we can respond in small ways to take care of ourselves. Or when we are more attuned to subtle emotions, we can seek emotional support sooner than if we are not paying attention due to overwhelm. So I think we would all agree that caregiving, not always, but caregiving can be really overwhelming. So I would say the first step to taking care of a problem is really understanding what the problem is. So when we are aware of sensations in the body, we can respond in small ways. Or when we, so then caregiving can be really overwhelming, but when we're really paying close attention, we can do something about that overwhelm. Next slide, please. So let's try a little bit of this together. I've talked about meditation a little bit, and what I'd like to do now is lead us through a short meditation. So I would invite you to begin to notice what it feels like sitting upon the chair that you're in. Begin to notice the contact of your body against the surface you're sitting upon. And if it's comfortable for you, let yourself close your eyes. It's fine to leave them open. Begin to notice the position of your hands resting upon a desk, resting upon your upper thighs and your lap. Begin to notice your posture. In meditation, there's no need to be overly stiff, but just notice your posture and allow yourself to make any small adjustments so that you can sit still for just a few minutes during the meditation. Notice your belly, and notice if you're holding any tension in your belly. When I'm talking to caregivers and we're meditating, I'd like to remind them of the straight back but the soft belly. And our straight back really conveys our strength as caregivers, and our soft belly really conveys our receptivity and our vulnerability as just human beings. Notice if you're holding any tension in your upper shoulders and your jaw, around your eyes, anywhere in your body. See if you can notice any areas of tension. And just breathe into these areas and just for a few minutes, let things soften. And in your own time, let your attention find its way to your breathing. Noticing the in-breath and the out-breath. There's no need to change your breathing pattern. Just notice you're breathing in and you're breathing out. And your only job here is to really notice when you become distracted. And when you notice you become distracted by some thought, by something in your environment, by my voice, just gently, without judgment, allow your attention to return to the breath. So we'll just sit quietly for a moment or two. And we'll just notice the breath, the breathing in and the breathing out. Nowhere to be except right here, right now, in this moment. How curious can we be about this act of breathing in and breathing out? Noticing the breath, observing present moment awareness. And now, if your eyes are closed, allow yourself to open your eyes and maybe stretch a little bit, move your shoulders, move your hands. Thank you for that short meditation. I found it extremely helpful. So next slide, please. Let's look at what happens very naturally, not just in meditation, but when we're focused on a particular activity. So we can see from this illustration, when we realize that the mind is distracted, we have a moment of noticing, and then we have the ability to redirect our attention back to focused attention, and we can dwell in focused attention for as long as we do, and then the mind gets distracted as it does. And upon noticing the distracted mind, we redirect. So having been a meditator for at least 25 years of my life now, I know this routine, this cycle, this process really, really well. So I would say it is true that I have developed an ability to keep my attention focused for longer. It is still true that the mind just simply, my mind gets distracted. So I think the real key here is that we don't make a big deal out of the distraction, but we redirect. And we redirect with kindness and without judgment, and we do this again and again. And in fact, a lot of the recent scientific studies on the brain of meditators, what they find is that the really good stuff happens when we notice we're distracted and we redirect. That's when we begin to build these new neural pathways, actually. So next slide, please. So again, short, simple meditative activities throughout your day can build mindfulness. So we didn't meditate for very long at all. So that's just an example of how short an intervention can be. Let's now look at some ways of strengthening mindfulness through practical interventions that any of us can practice throughout our day. Next slide. Okay, so some examples. Take 3 intentional deep breaths. So there's been studies that show that 3 deep intentional breaths actually will activate the parasympathetic nervous system of the body, which calms the body and the mind. So it doesn't take all that long to stop and take 3 intentional breaths. Or using activities like drinking water, washing hands, answering the phone, etc., to return to the present moment. If we're not present to taking a drink of water or coffee or tea, we can choke and gag. So it's a really wonderful moment just to stop, return to the body, and notice what's happening as we drink, as we swallow. Washing hands is an important thing to do when caregiving. Is another opportunity to really feel the sensation of the water upon your hands and the slippery nature of the soap. Or if you're gelling in or gelling out, as they say, with antibacterial lotion. When you hear your phone ring, you can pause and take a breath. When entering the room, you might place a hand upon the door frame and just stop. Take a breath and then enter. So these are ways to just kind of slow things down, return to awareness of the body, return to the present moment. So setting an intention for mindfulness before beginning a task. I remember a teacher of mine saying, when I'm in conversation, keep about 30% of my attention in my body. And this has allowed me to stay grounded and present in conversations and even convey a sense of connection to the person I'm talking with. So if we set this intention before we delve into a conversation, this can be really helpful. Feeling your feet planted on the floor and sensing into that connection, again, can help us return to calm and groundedness. When we close our eyes and listen to the sounds in the environment around us, this is another way to disrupting, distracting thought patterns or stories that we're telling ourselves and return to the present moment. Okay, well, so what you're seeing there is a stop sign on the left. And so I want to introduce you, if you've not been familiarized with this practice, this is the practice of stop. Stop isn't just S as in stop, T as in take a breath, O as in observe, and P as in proceed. So again, just another moment, another reminder rather, to just pause, to notice what's happening right in this moment in our own internal process, see what's happening around us, and then proceed. So we describe meditation and mindfulness as a dose response. That is to say, the more we practice, the more impact we see in our lives. So I don't want to oversimplify mindfulness practice, but I also do want to emphasize that these short interventions can really build a mindful state of awareness that will support us in the stressful role of being a family caregiver. So the practices that I described are things that any of us can do at any point during our day. And the more you practice, the greater the benefit. So you can trust, based on a lot of the science that's coming out recently, that these practices, if you engage in them over time, will really retrain the brain. And you will see yourself responding differently to the challenges that are faced in life. Next slide, please. So I just want to introduce you to another practice, simple practice that supports resilience and that builds upon the mindfulness practice. Next slide. And that is the practice of self-compassion. There we go. And so self-compassion is really a state of mind and body that recognizes and responds to our own suffering. So when we talk about compassion, there's compassion for others and compassion for oneself. And what we find is that actually for some people, it's easier to experience compassion for others than it is to experience compassion for oneself. This may be true for you. For some of us, we more readily experience compassion for ourselves, but that tends to be fewer of us. What I want to introduce to you today is a very simple practice of expressing self-compassion towards yourself when you're experiencing distress or when you're encountering a challenging situation. Next slide. Okay, so 3 essential components of self-compassion. Next slide. So the first is awareness. So we need to be aware of the fact that in this moment, in this encounter, I'm experiencing some difficulty or I'm suffering. And so this harkens back to the kind of awareness that's cultivated through mindfulness. When we notice maybe the stomach tenses up, or maybe our shoulders tense up. Maybe we begin to sweat or blush, or we can feel the heat of anger arising. Whatever it is, but we're aware of a situation that's causing us some distress or difficulty. Then there's shared humanity, and this is reminding ourselves that to be human means that we will encounter difficulty and we will encounter challenges and we will suffer. So it's a reminder that we are not alone. And then the third essential component to self-compassion is kindness. So reminding ourselves that, I am actually worthy of my own kindness in this moment of difficulty. And I want to just honor that for some people, it's really, really difficult to experience self-compassion for oneself and to actually be kind to oneself. We live in a culture that prioritizes strength and independence, and consequently, a lot of us have been raised in a way that just makes it really difficult for us to be kind to our own self. But the good news is that with practice, we can develop that kind of expression of kindness towards ourselves when we're in a difficult situation. Okay, so if it's comfortable for you, let's pause for a moment here. And once again, close your eyes if you're in a situation where you can do that. And place one of your hands or both of your hands just upon your chest over your heart. And next slide, please. And now take 3 deep breaths. Just really follow those breaths into the belly and then exhale. And we'll do this 3 times. Great. Now, consider to yourself your last couple days and see if you can locate in your memory an experience that you found difficult or challenging. Just let your mind dwell upon those circumstances, that situation, for just a moment or two, remembering where you were, who you were with, where you were, what was happening. And now imagine yourself in that situation or in a similar situation. And repeat to yourself the following. I am experiencing difficulty in this moment. I am experiencing difficulty in this moment. Being human can be difficult, yet I want to decrease my suffering. Being human can be difficult, yet I want to decrease my suffering. I am worthy of my own compassion, my own kindness. I am worthy of my own compassion, my own kindness. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I be kind to myself in this moment. Okay, so once again, we can see that a practice like this, it brings us to a place of awareness. So the recognition that we're experiencing difficulty. It acknowledges that there is shared common humanity in this experience, that we are not alone, that to be human means we encounter challenges. There's an intentional component where we remind ourselves that we are in fact worthy of our own compassion and kindness. And then finally, there's an act of compassion, or there's compassionate action, where we encourage ourselves to be kind to ourselves in this moment, in this difficult encounter. And I want to say something about this practice. Some situations that we encounter as caregivers cannot be simply fixed. So at the very least, what we can do is express compassion for ourselves in this moment. And what we find is that if we can do this, it really does enhance our resilience, and it allows us to stay active in the role longer, over a longer term. And it just allows us to keep going back, knowing that it's quite likely that we're going to continue to encounter really difficult situations. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's just recap what I've shared with you today. So we saw that there is this important relationship between mindfulness and resilience. That cultivating mindfulness allows us to bounce back more quickly from difficult situations because it calms our minds. We're better able to concentrate and focus our attention, and we're able to be more aware of exactly what's going on when encountering a difficult situation. And the heightened resilience leads to a greater sense of well-being. So we saw that mindfulness is paying attention on purpose without judgment, and that resilience is the ability to bounce back from challenging situations. And we talked a little bit about meditation as being a disciplined inner reflective practice, and typically it's used to develop mindfulness. And again, mindfulness calms the mind, improves concentration, and increases awareness. And we can use simple meditative activities throughout the day to build and cultivate mindfulness. And then finally, we engaged in a self-compassion practice that supports resilience by helping us move through difficult experiences more quickly. So thank you. At this point, next slide, I'd like to open it up for any questions that you might have about anything that I've shared or some of the work we do at Zen Caregiving Project. So I'll pause here and turn it over to Kelvin.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Roy. We're really happy that you're able to spend this morning or afternoon with us. There are a lot of questions, so I think we should get right into them. The first question is from someone who wanted to know a little bit more about how to kind of decompress in the moment of high stress situation. Maybe they're starting to feel their heart beating faster, maybe they're getting a little flush, kind of getting into that argument stage. Would that be a situation where they might consider using stop or some of these other techniques you've mentioned during the webinar?
Yes, exactly. When I teach meditation, there's a phrase that I often use, and that is go to the body, go to the body. So when we're in those moments where we can feel ourselves getting agitated, upregulated, really activated because of a sense of overwhelm or some emotional response, when we go to the body and pay attention to the quickened heartbeat or the flush of heat wherever that is in the body, or this urge to run away, we can simply begin to notice and get really curious about the sensation. And what I've experienced in those moments when I go to the body is that by paying attention to those physical sensations and my own emotional response, it offers me an opportunity to just pause and more clearly think through what is a skillful response and what is the best way to deal with the situation. We spent some time focusing on the breath, and I think that this is another way that we can really just calm down the system in those moments of agitation. So I would encourage the listener to try it and see if anything shifts for them.
Great. And then as a follow-up, in terms of maybe more of the strong emotions that one may experience, or often experience as caregiving, what about something more kind of long duration, maybe more aching, like a feeling of guilt? How would you recommend they confront those guilty feelings of maybe not wanting to care for someone, maybe not being very feeling guilty that they perhaps don't have the loving feelings they feel they should have caring for someone who has been part of their life, like a family member or a relative?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. You know, I've worked a lot with caregivers who are professional caregivers, clinical caregivers, and family caregivers. And being a family caregiver is so challenging because these relationships are so complex. And so an issue or complexity like guilt is really historical or deep-seated in the relationship. And so what I would encourage is that one, get really curious about that guilt. Where is it coming from? Where does it manifest in the body? What is my habitual way of responding to guilt? Getting really curious about it. And, I think it's always good to, once we figure out where it is originating, then maybe change the pattern of response to that emotion. But the other thing I want to say about this particular question is that, some of these things, some of these emotional responses may not be able to be adequately addressed by the practices that I've introduced, and really quite possibly require the intervention of a trained professional like a therapist, because they may originate in our childhood when we were in relationship to this loved one. So the only other thing I would say is that when we cultivate mindfulness, it begins to change the nature of our conversations. I think it can build a certain courage to voice certain truths and to ask certain questions that maybe we haven't felt comfortable asking before. Because we feel a greater capacity to stay in difficult conversations. And so if one is feeling calm and grounded and curious, they may be able to participate in a conversation that begins to unpack these feelings of guilt. And it also, this quality of mind that we develop through mindfulness, I think allows us to be more authentic and honest around our boundaries in these complex relationships with the ones we're caring for. But I appreciate that question. I hope that's helpful.
Perfect. I wanted to move a little bit. There were some questions, maybe more on the nuts and bolts of introducing a mindfulness practice in a kind of daily or maybe weekly or kind of element. This listener is maybe looking to introduce or looking to start doing these mindfulness practices, these meditative practices. What would you recommend for someone just starting out, a new person? Is it something that you might go in, that you might overdo in terms of trying to do too much at once? Maybe to do a gradual, to gradually introduce this into their day? How would you recommend people start introducing mindfulness on just kind of if they've never done it before?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I get this question a lot. And I would go back to the 3 deep intentional breaths. I would recommend that someone, set an intention for themselves that they're going to pause at least, 5 times throughout their day and just follow 3 deep breaths, and build from there. And it's easy for me to imagine that practice, if it feels useful and can be maintained, would then lead to 5 minutes of following the breath and returning to the breath after we become distracted. And, maybe that would be supported by a new intention that, during my lunch hour for 5 minutes, I'm going to sit on my own in my car, underneath a tree, on the porch, wherever, and just sit quietly for 5 minutes, trying to keep my attention focused on the sensation of breathing in and breathing out, and returning to the breath when I become distracted. and let that be your practice for a few weeks. And I really think there's a lot of wisdom in taking baby steps, as they say. So in our courses, when we talk about self-care, we encourage people to take on practices that are very simple and achievable. And I talked a little bit about judgment and being kind to ourselves when we um, get distracted or when we fail or encounter a difficult situation. And I think when it comes to taking on a meditation practice, this is a really important piece. So there's no reason to make a big deal out of it. You know, there will be certain days when we don't do it. There will be days when we do. And I think as long as we're having those days when we do practice some mindfulness, we'll begin to recognize the usefulness of it and the benefit, and it will actually become a sort of refuge for us, and we can really start to look forward to it. So I would just say, start small, take on one of the practices that I shared, and just see where that leads you to. Um, You know, the mind so readily becomes distracted. In fact, Microsoft in 2012 did a study um, measuring the average length of time that the human brain could focus on one task in particular. And they found that that length of time is about 8 seconds. So I think to start off, you know, trying to sit down for 30 minutes and meditate is probably not all that useful, actually, because it's just going to be a long process of getting distracted and returning, and that's fine. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I really encourage people to start off with these really short interventions.
Great. And you mentioned again about some of the courses you teach. I know that you have a lot of courses both in the San Francisco Bay Area, but also online. Could you maybe explain give us just a little bit of an overview of what you offer in as online offerings? Because I know a lot of our listeners are from out of town or maybe even out of the country.
Right. So we have begun offering um, a lot of courses online through the Zoom platform, like the one we're using today. And we actually have one coming up. It's Mindful Caregiving Education for Family Caregivers. And so this is going to be a 4-part online series. Each session is 2 hours long. And in these classes, we cover topics or modules, as we refer to them, such as mindfulness, of course, cultivating compassion, looking at the role of loss in the caregiving experience, looking at mindful communications. We talk a little bit about what we call practice of counsel, and that really offers family caregivers an opportunity to share their story of caregiving, because as many of us recognize, being in the role of family caregiver can often be very isolated. And so we have found that it's extremely supportive and useful for family caregivers to have an opportunity to tell their story. So everything we're teaching or sharing has been translated into language that I would say is very accessible to people from any spiritual or religious background, any cultural background. Um, and we've taken these 2,500-year-old practices and we've really formed them into these very practical interventions, like many of the ones that I've shared with you today. So the feedback that we get from family caregivers is that the skills and practices that we teach are extremely relevant and useful when it comes to emotional well-being. I should say that the skills like administering medication, body mechanics when moving someone, universal precautions, things like that, we don't really cover. There are a lot of organizations who are covering those sorts of things. But what we have found is that these emotional skills are often overlooked. And so that's where we really focus our attention.
Great. And then in terms of, actually, I had a separate question, sorry, a completely different question about sandwich caregivers. So we know that a lot of caregivers are maybe Gen Xers or perhaps boomers, so they're multi-generational families, so there might be the parents who are taking care of younger children or maybe teenagers who are also taking care of their own parents, so they're taking care of
Mm.
two separate generations. So in terms of the parents, you mentioned how maybe people around them, as you are more stressed, people are perhaps pick up on that and themselves maybe get a little bit more anxious and stressed out. But these practices you mentioned, the mindfulness, the meditation, the self care, are these things that might make sense for parents who are caregivers of, say, another a parent, adult children, sorry, who are
Mhm.
caregivers of their parents? Would this be something they might talk with or share with their own children who are in this kind of multi-generational caregiving situation?
Absolutely. I mean, I love the sound of that. And one of the things that a lot of family caregivers often overlook is the extent to which they're being watched or observed. And they're really modeling for the younger ones who will be in the role at some point, who are coming up behind them. And so I actually take a viewpoint whereby I see um, family caregiving as a rite of passage of sorts. And what we know from rites of passage is that, when we go through a transformative process like significant passage or initiation, we come out of it with gifts, realizations, visions that we can pass on to those people in our communities who will benefit from our own difficult experience. So um, the the sandwich caregiver is a huge problem. It's really prevalent these days. And so I think we just need to really learn from each other. And these practices that I've shared with you today um, are really beneficial, I believe, for even non-caregivers. And the more we can, I wouldn't wait until we're in the role of caregiver, because as we're practicing mindfulness, we're building our resilience, and this resilience will serve us when we find ourselves in the role. So I think it's fair to say that the practices are beneficial, whatever our particular caregiving situation or circumstance is. So I think these would be really beneficial for people who are finding themselves caring for their children while caring for a parent, while holding down a job. It's not going to take that situation away and necessarily, make it easier, but it's going to give us the tools to build greater capacity to meet the challenges of being in those circumstances.
Great. I think we have time for just two more quick questions. I had one listener who wanted to know about how you might deal with the ups and downs, the kind of highs and lows that maybe are very wearing on emotions. Does that is that part of building resilience in terms of being able to buffer yourself against the highs and lows, the extremes of emotions that can sometimes happen?
I think so. I think what these practices support is a different way of responding to our emotions. Um, Very quickly, when I first started doing the hospice work, I was so fearful of the whole topic of death and dying. And In the process, I realized that fear wasn't necessarily going to go away. That emotional response to the thought of my own death or the death of my loved ones wasn't necessarily going to go away. But through my practice of mindfulness, by turning toward the emotion rather than trying to turn away from it, I created an intimacy with that emotion, and the emotion became this kind of familiar old response, this familiar old friend. And so the emotion of fear itself became less debilitating. It wouldn't stop me in my tracks. I could experience the emotion. I could recognize all the familiar patterns of that emotion, and I could carry on doing what I normally do. So I think these highs and lows that you talk about are really common for a lot of caregivers. And I think the practices that I've touched upon today allow us to ride those waves. And in the process of learning to ride those waves, the emotional charge actually will begin to diminish a little bit. So, yeah, I think I would encourage people to try these practices when they begin to notice that these big emotional experiences are coming up. You know, in the midst of your heightened anxiety, can you just stop and simply follow the breath? Can you feel your feet on the floor? You know, can you put your own hand upon your heart and recognize, ah, here's anxiety again, and I'm not alone. I want to minimize my anxiety. Let me just hold myself in this anxious moment like a mother would hold her own child, right? And this can help. Try it.
Great. And then for a final question, I had a couple questions about kind of introducing this practice, the meditative practice, the mindfulness practice, to people who are maybe a little bit skeptical. Perhaps they are religious, and this religion views maybe different traditional practices with a bit of suspicion. Maybe they consider it kind of like therapy and might have had poor experiences with therapy in past. How might you recommend someone could encourage someone maybe to explore these different possibilities? Maybe it's another spouse, or it could be an adult child with a parent who's a caregiver, or some other relationship like that.
Sure. Well, a couple things. One is um, perhaps it's useful to be less concerned about convincing someone of the usefulness of mindfulness and focusing on ourselves. Like when I'm with this person who is resistant and they're experiencing difficulty or they're being difficult, am I grounded? Am I calm? Am I attentive to their experience? Or am I just trying to distract them because I'm uncomfortable? So paying attention to our own inner experience, I think, is probably the most important piece. And then, you know, we're modeling for them a certain quality of presence and attention and groundedness. And maybe they notice that in us and get curious, but maybe not. But I think we can use whatever language is most comfortable for us or the person we're caring for who may express resistance. We don't have to call it meditation. We don't have to call it mindfulness. Every spiritual tradition from around the world throughout time has some reflective or contemplative practice that just quiets the mind, quiets or calms the body. So it just so happens that, you know, the practices that we've refined, you know, come from a particular tradition, but these traditions exist in all cultures. So if we're sitting with someone who expresses a lot of resistance, maybe what's safe for them, if you have this kind of relationship, is just to ask, well, can I just sit for a moment and hold your hand? And then begin following your breath. We're so quick to fill the silence with words. Maybe we just sit quietly together, noticing the breath, feeling the sensation of one hand holding another. Asking them, well, what does it feel like, the contact beneath your body, between your body and the bed you're laying upon, or the chair you're sitting upon, or in this moment, can you feel your feet on the ground? Why? Oh, I'm just curious what that feels like for you, just to bring people back into their bodies. And, I guess I would add, for some people who are experiencing pain, returning to the body can actually be really uncomfortable and distressing. In those situations, maybe there is a part of the body that's pain-free, and we can draw someone's attention to that part of the body. So I think these practices ask of us a particular type of creativity. And so if we're going to share them, we want to be creative and find the language that works. But I'll just go back to my first point, and that is, at least let's focus on ourselves, because we shouldn't underestimate the healing impact of calm, presence, and deep human connection, even if it's only for a moment or two.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I wish we had more time for questions, but we're actually a little bit over time. Thanks, Roy, for being a good sport and answering some more questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending this afternoon. The webinars are a free and continuing series. There is more information about our next webinar coming up in March on our website, caregiver.org. Thanks again, Roy, for joining us today.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you to everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. The webinar is now concluded. We hope to see you all for the next one, and have a great afternoon.